That was a wonderful reading. And I've just for our conversation, I have almost kind of like constellations of questions rather than like one question leading to another. As I sort of thought about your work and read through in sequence, the questions kind of came to me almost like interconnected ones. And I'd like to start out small, but again, sort of give you the chance to respond to any or all, or just to pick up on any one of these. Again, they're interrelated. But my first question was, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about your working process. I know that at one point you used to take notes on 3x5 cards. And how did that process work? Was it a way to key into the essential moments of a poem? Did the cards enable you to leap from one insight to another? In arranging or rearranging the cards, could you, for instance, assemble and disassemble the linearity of a poem? Did you take lots and lots of notes on the cards and then sift down to what was essential? Or did you work from small outward? Can you talk about how your working process with notes is how it works over time, and if the process has changed for you? Certainly the new poems are really quite different.
I feel like just saying yes. I think that my working process is a pragmatic response to modern life, which is fragmented and fast and doesn't allow the contemplative space that you would be ideal. So I got a method of reading. I get an idea of what I want to work on, and then I guess my process is a method of holding the whole situation in me while I'm living a regular life. And so I have the idea, then I do reading, and I read in a kind of a trance. Out of that lower consciousness of reading, I can underline things in the book. So I usually will take a French philosophy book and a Buddhist text and something like a environmental book, something like that, and then I put those in the computer, and then I print them out, and then I cut them up, and I put them on this great big table according to like some kind of structure, and then I cut pictures up and I put them all over, so I don't have to keep it all. It's a way of working on a poem without having to keep it all in your mind. So.
And a lot of those sort of phrases that are on the cards, they get absorbed into the poem, or does it sort of sift itself out, like ones as you rearrange on the table, ones that sort of like the more essential ones come forward somehow?
I think as time goes by, there's less and less resemblance between what I actually write and the notes. It used to be a straight appropriation. When I was doing the 4-year-old girl, I had so many pictures of deformed children all across my table, and then I had a break-in, and the policeman came to take the report down, and I had all these naked.
I guess one other thought is maybe with the text, what you mentioned about photographs to me is interesting, that maybe there's a kind of polarity with the text and the image, that maybe the image or somehow is a way to personalize in a way that maybe like some of the reading, some of the research might be more impersonal. And one of the fascinating things I think you do is how you sort of weave or work the kind of tension between the impersonal and the personal, and maybe that's there in the working process. It's just a thought that occurs to me.
I think we think of the visual as more concrete. But I think of also the emotions or thought as concrete.
You said once that you felt committed to the sentence, and I guess I wondered what the implications of that are, because to me it's interesting. Most people think of like the sentence as a unit of prose and maybe the line as a unit of poetry, and for instance like the stanza as a building block of a poem. But I think you're firmly committed to the sentence, and what does that mean? What are the implications of that?
It was as a student that I said that, and it was, you don't know which direction to go in, and for some reason I just gave that as a rule to myself because, since then I've been involved with the people who write language poetry and things, but you can go in any direction. It was a way I said for my direction up until now. Now I'm trying to whittle away at the sentence because people don't use sentences anymore. Yeah.
This next question has to do with geography, really. You have a long history of living in New Mexico and also in New York. Certainly the landscape and the light of northern New Mexico have been a strong influence on your work. One might, for instance, argue that the long line that you use has an antecedent or equivalent in the long horizon one has here in the Southwest. Do you see New Mexico and New York as providing a kind of north-south or east-west axis to your work? And what's the relationship between language and landscape? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't have anything general to say, but I've lived up in Rio Viva County since 1973, and the space and the light have meant everything to me. And I think in some ways it's very tough up there, and to stand out in that space, you need to gather some density around you. And I think that, that also shows in the language. And now I think of it differently because I think of myself as a more dispersed self. So, the landscape will comply, with whatever you're doing. And so the light, the changing light is part of it. And actually, New York is not a source for my writing at all. It's critical.
How about science, and in particular biology? Has that been an important influence on your work?
When I started writing scientific language, it was the earlier period in feminism, and it was a language that was masculine, entirely masculine. And I don't think it was a conscious purpose of mine, but it was something that I'm interested in science, and I think that part of my process at that time was to take the language and make it something that was feminine. And I think that my mind is just it just has to say, should I go this way or this way? And then if I go this way, I don't go that way. And it lends itself to science. Or then later on I went into philosophical thinking from scientific. Mm-hmm.
It seems like you read a lot of philosophy, that in many ways the poetry that you write is a kind of personal epistemology. It's a way of seeing the landscape and seeing the world and coming to understand the world in a particular way. Do you feel like contemporary philosophy has been an important influence on you?
Very, very important. I was born in another country, and my first language acquisition was in another language, and I think a lot of my quest is about the relativities of meaning, and both among human beings and in the world. But I didn't know anything about philosophy. You've always studied philosophy, but I never. I tell this story over and over again. But my first philosophy book came from the writer Leslie Silko, and I was at Yaddo, and she mailed me Remarks on Color by Wittgenstein, and she said, "Mei Mei, I think you should read this. It reminds me a little bit of you." And then that determined my reading for ever since. You know, I was in my late 30s. Yeah.
I like the poem Ideal, where you talked about like experiencing a new color, which is really kind of a fantastic moment, I think. And I don't know if you're aware of, you know, in David Hume, there's a famous passage which is called The Missing Shade of Blue, where he imagines, he creates this sort of person and says, well, what if a person could see all of these shades of blue, but one shade is missing? Could that person actually infer what that shade is? And, you know, Hume is an absolute skeptic. It's like this happens and that happens, and there's no relation. There's no such thing as cause.
I am also, actually. But we were in his house in Scotland, and it is the most beautiful, organized, light, intelligent space. Yeah. So.
The other sort of constellation of questions that I had, or that are interrelated, has to do with collaboration. And I know very early on in New York City, I think maybe it was at Basement Workshop, you did a collaboration with a dancer, I think, or a group of dancers. And then obviously you went on and did a collaboration with Richard, and you've done one recently with Kiki Smith. How have the collaborations affected how you've worked? Have you sort of like sought them out, or they've just sort of come to you? And how have they changed or influenced your work?
They've had a tremendous influence on my work because you know that, I was a miserable, solitary hermit all of my life before I got married 10 years ago. And you just think about your own things and suffering. And so when people came and asked me, I would say yes. And it was such a wonderful thing to, first of all, you get out of the Western idea of the individual egotistical artist, and you find a way of joining with another sensibility, and that has enabled me to, and having to adapt. In this one case, it was dance. From doing the dances, I learned how to take. I don't know why it was, but I used to write things that I saw and combine them and try to be surprising. But then I realized you didn't have to do what you saw. You could take the red from a vase, and you could take something that happened and a feeling from somewhere else. And I guess the analysis of the movement. With Richard, I think it was more. I guess. I don't know formally what I did except change my life, And then with Kiki, I figured out I was writing these sentences, and these stanzas, and I was sick of them, and I didn't know how to get them apart. And I tried to be like Wallace Stevens, and then because the book was long and my poem was short, I had to take the stanzas apart, and I've written. I don't write in stanzas anymore after that. It's great not to have so much control over your work, too.
So maybe it's a way of shedding some kind of overt control and discovering some other kind of order or pattern that can be there.
Yeah. Have you found that with collaboration?
I think so. I think it's extremely challenging, and I've really only done it once, and found it extremely challenging to do. And actually, we both worked with Tandun, the composer, and I did a piece called The Silk Road, and I wrote it.
He's more like a steamroller than a collaborator.
Yeah, he has very definite ideas about what he wants. In the case of the collaboration with Kiki, did you write the poem and then she did images? I'm just trying to understand the sort of process a little more. Did her visual images affect how you wrote the poem? Was there a lot of back and forth, or was it, how did it happen?
Kiki says, you know, she would come here. Actually, it was the first time she came to New Mexico, but she said, well, Mei Mei would ask me, it was great collaborating, Mei Mei would ask me these questions and then I would cry. And then from those questions she did some drawings, and then I did some writing, and then I adjusted somewhat, but she didn't. Then she did the book, and then I took the stanzas apart, and so.
How about I'm sort of putting this aside now and just thinking of other questions that come to mind. I know you worked in Alaska you went there a number of times working with the Artists in the Schools program, but you went to some very remote regions of Alaska, and certainly you read the poem that has the breakup in it. How did Alaska, I feel like Alaska's a strong influence on your work in many ways too, and I'm just trying to put that out for discussion. Do you feel like it was really important in terms of the evolution of your work?
Well, it's a tremendous situation there. I would say that a kind of marginality, which I just found out is what everyone's thinking about, but I think all my life I've had a dialogue with situations of people on the margin, and I think partly from being from somewhere else. And that was a very concentrated case of that, combined with the landscape, which is what I like, an empty landscape where you can see the horizon. And I think to be in a place where you're at a junction where between when there's no written language and when, you know, like young, you know, like teenage boys are writing down in language their emotion, was, you know, was a way of magnifying the experience of the culture, and also to be in a place that was disappearing, and the toughness of the climate and the disappearance. And I went to one village where it was a place where people lived, but the village was dead. And at the same time, it was a kind of economic boom town, if you remember that. And so all those complexities held me.
I think one other question that comes to mind is you were born in Beijing, you were born in China, and then you came to America. And do you feel that that's sort of always there when you're writing in English, that there's a kind of twist of language or different sort of, that sort of China is always there in the background in a way?
I do, I feel that, but it wasn't until recently that I, you know, because of the way the multiculturalism was, I think that I always felt an implicit criticism for being more assimilated. And for example, you and I, like we've had a friendship for so long, and we are from the same place, but did you ever think that's why we are friends, because we're from the same place?
I didn't think so.
No, I didn't either.
It's not like everyone from Beijing has to be friends.
But I think it's a little bit of a blind spot to never to have occurred to either one of us. So I think that it's there, but it hasn't been allowed to be visible except in certain stereotypical ways. And so I'm reading this book by Gayatri Spivak. I told you about it, and it's her recent book, and it's called Outside in the Teaching Machine. And I love reading it. She's a Hindu woman who has a high position as a philosopher at Columbia. And because it's a more cosmopolitan, much more cosmopolitan, like examination of being from somewhere else, I think she's somebody because of the way she went to school. She came at English from an empowered position. So I say yes. I mean, who your mother is always part of who you are.
I know you visited China at one point. Were you able to like visit where you
I visited the house where I was born, and I was pregnant, and my aunt was dying who was an obstetrician, was dying of cancer. And she was blind at the time, but she got her colleague for 30 years to come, and I lay down and she examined me with her colleague's eyes. And and she had a little Dutch picture in her room, and she said, that is the river of my work.
My last question is really, what's next? Do you have a new project in mind?
I think I've been, in the last year, I think I've been wanting just to take everything apart and see what goes back together again. And a lot of that I'm questioning very much, just what I mentioned before, what work is and what you're trying to achieve with it, and what the person is who's doing the work, and how much you're responsible for that, and how, what are you're trying to do good work, and what does good work mean, and you're trying to do the best, and what does that mean, and I think that it's a way of veering away from the central figure, or the central person, and I don't know how that's going to be, but I want to write, I'm thinking of writing about Kuan Yin. Because it seems like you can really regret, you make so many efforts to get somewhere, and sometimes you can regret that, but for Kuan Yin, when there's compassion, you never regret when you were compassionate. So these things and the value of art and things that I'm thinking about. Kuan Yin in New Mexico.
Just thank you for the conversation. If you have
Thank
something
you.
else.
Thank you.